The courthouse buzzed with quiet footsteps, the shuffle of papers, and the soft click of heels echoing across polished floors. It was a Monday morning like any other. Routine. Predictable. The docket was packed, but most cases were expected to be short, procedural, just names and numbers moving through a tired system, until she walked in. At first, no one noticed her. She didn't demand attention. She didn't arrive with a team of lawyers or the chaos of a media circus. Just a woman in her early 30s, with deep brown skin, calm eyes, and a steady, thoughtful stride. Her name was Elena Pierce. Elena wore a navy blue suit, nothing flashy. Her natural hair was braided into a crown, simple and elegant. She carried a single worn leather folder in one hand and a smooth oak cane in the other. The cane didn't suggest weakness. It tapped against the marble deliberately, more a rhythm than a crutch. One step, tap, another tap. She wasn't late, just last, on purpose. Room 12B, the old courtroom tucked at the far end of the building, had seen its share of stories, but no one in it knew that what was about to unfold would echo far beyond its walls. Judge Ronald Kessler sat high on the bench, a man whose face looked like it had been carved from stone, expressionless, but always somehow disapproving. For years, he'd ruled over this room, quietly, powerfully. Some called him the Wall, not because he was strong, but because nothing ever moved him. Arguments, facts, emotion, it all bounced off, and many whispered, if not feared, that his prejudice wasn't just personal, it was procedural. He had dismissed people not just for their actions, but for how they looked, how they spoke, who they were, and he rarely had to raise his voice to do it. Elena's case was listed as misrepresentation of credentials in a government bid, a fraud charge, a serious one, but the file was oddly thin, too thin. Kessler skimmed it with a raised brow, already unimpressed. "Ms. Pierce," he said, without looking up, "I assume you're aware of the allegations." Elena didn't answer. She didn't flinch either. The silence stretched. The judge finally glanced up and raised one corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, more a signal. "We do speak in here, Ms. Pierce, unless, of course, they didn't teach that wherever you came from." Still, Elena said nothing. She set her folder gently on the table and adjusted the microphone slightly, but her lips remained still. A few rows behind her, the murmurs began. They were soft, like wind rustling through dry leaves. A woman in the back crossed her arms tighter. A young man took out his phone, pretending to check a text, but hit record instead. No one said it aloud, but many knew what this was. They'd seen it before, just not quite like this. The judge leaned forward. "You're not mute, are you?" he asked, mockingly. "Or is this some kind of performance art?" Elena raised her eyes, slowly, calmly. Her voice, when it finally came, was neither loud nor defensive. "I'm here to respond to the court," she said, not to entertain it. A low, surprised breath rippled through the courtroom. The judge blinked, then laughed, quiet and cold. "Well, that's the first clever thing I've heard in here today," he said. "Let's see how long it lasts." He opened her file again, flipping to a page that barely rustled. "So," he continued, "you claim to have been awarded a federal contract using your own firm's credentials, but upon review, there is the suspicion that you didn't even have the proper degrees or licensure at the time of the bid. Care to explain that?" Elena tilted her head slightly. "The documents you have are incomplete." "Oh, I'm sure they are," he said dryly. "They usually are when someone's trying to cover their tracks. I submitted the full file. Perhaps it wasn't received." He waved a hand, dismissing her entirely. "Of course, it's always someone else's fault, isn't it?" This time, Elena's lips curved, it not into a smile, but something close to it. Not amusement, but clarity. "No, Your Honor," she said. "I'm here because someone made a mistake. I just haven't decided whether it was intentional yet." The clerk behind the bench coughed. The prosecutor glanced up from his notes, intrigued now. Kessler's jaw tensed. "I see," he said, tone clipped. "So we're not just clever, we're bold." "I've been called worse," she said, eyes still calm. He narrowed his gaze. "I'm sure you have." The weight of that sentence hung in the room like thick smoke. It wasn't just about her case anymore, and everyone knew it. That's when something shifted. A man in the third row, mid-40s, leaned over to the woman beside him. "Isn't she the one from that tech grant program? Last year," he whispered. "Didn't she speak at the university?" The woman nodded. "Yeah, Elena Pierce. She's got like 2 master's degrees, one from Howard, the other from MIT. Started her own engineering firm in Atlanta. Then what's she doing here? I don't know, she said, but something's off. Alina gently reached for her folder and opened it. One by one, she pulled out documents, each in a clear protective sleeve. Degrees, letters of verification, government compliance certifications, none of them flashy, all of them real. May I approach the bench? She asked. Judge Kessler stared at her. You may hand it to the bailiff. No disrespect, Your Honor, she replied, but I'd prefer to present it directly. Some pages have context your clerk may miss. There was a long pause, then a nod. She walked slowly but steadily, each step measured. As she reached the bench, she placed the folder in front of him, then stepped back exactly 3 feet, no more, no less. He opened it reluctantly. He flipped through it faster than necessary. His eyes paused on a few pages, then again, slower, and then, slower still. The courtroom was dead silent. After a full minute, he closed the folder. This doesn't change the charge, he said. It changes the facts. Alina responded gently. Kessler looked up. You think this is about facts? I think it should be, she said. But that's up to you. The judge bristled. But before he could respond, the door at the back of the courtroom opened quietly. A man in a dark suit entered. Federal observer. He took a seat in the last row without saying a word. But his presence didn't go unnoticed, least of all by the judge. Alina noticed too, but she didn't react. She didn't need to. What no one knew not yet was that this wasn't just a fraud hearing. It was a test, not for Alina, for the court itself. Her arrest had come 2 weeks earlier after an anonymous complaint flagged her bid documents. The charge was leveled in less than 48 hours. She wasn't allowed to speak at the preliminary hearing, and her evidence had mysteriously never made it into the official record. But Alina had not come to court to clear her name. That was only part of it. She came to shine a light on something much deeper, and Judge Ronald Kessler, with his years of unchecked bias, had just walked directly into it. He didn't know that 3 months earlier, Alina had been invited to consult with the Department of Justice on systemic biases in contract allocation and judicial behavior. He didn't know that she had agreed only under the condition of anonymity and that she'd volunteered to serve as a test case. Nor did he know that 3 observers were now monitoring his courtroom, his words, and his conduct as part of a federal inquiry. He had no idea the cameras were rolling in ways he couldn't see. And Alina Pierce had never been afraid of silence, because silence, when used correctly, speaks louder than shouting. She looked at the judge one last time. I have no desire to embarrass you, Your Honor, she said, but I do hope you understand what's at stake today. The judge swallowed, just barely. And for the first time in 27 years, the wall began to crack. He cleared his throat. This matter, he began slowly, will be reviewed further before proceeding to trial. But the words didn't carry the same weight they used to, because the courtroom no longer belonged to him. And the silence, it wasn't weakness, it was strategy. And Alina Pierce had just begun. It had been 3 days since the hearing. 3 long, quiet days. But Judge Ronald Kessler hadn't slept through a single night since, not peacefully anyway. The folder Pierce had handed him still sat untouched on his desk, though he had already read every page, twice. The facts were crystal clear. Her degrees were real. Her licenses were up to date. Her company, Pierce Integrated Systems, had not only met every federal requirement, it had outperformed expectations on 2 previous government contracts. The real mystery wasn't whether she was qualified. It was how this case had even landed in his courtroom in the first place. That question stuck with him, because Kessler didn't like loose ends or unexpected spotlights. He had built his entire career on control, on keeping things quiet, clean, and well-ordered. Alina's case was none of those things. It was disruptive, uncomfortable, and worst of all, it was public. Because someone in that courtroom had recorded everything. The comments, the disputativeness, the assumptions, and now, a 93-second clip titled "When Silence Destroys a Broken System" was circling social media. It had been viewed over 700,000 times in just 48 hours. Kessler hadn't seen it, but his law clerk had. So had his daughter, and 3 staff members in the administrative office, who suddenly grew very quiet whenever he walked past. By the end of the week, a quiet review panel had been formed within the state's Judicial Oversight Committee. Not formally, not yet, but the buzz had begun. Meanwhile, Alina Pierce was in a conference room across town, seated at a long mahogany table surrounded by 4 federal investigators, 2 attorneys from the Office of Civil Rights, and a woman in a gray suit who didn't say much, but whose badge bore the Department of Justice seal. The room was cool and silent. Alina wasn't nervous. She was observant. One of the investigators leaned forward. "Miss Pierce, or should I say Dr. Pierce, your composure in that courtroom was remarkable." "I wasn't there to perform," she replied simply. "No, but the judge was." That made Alina glance up, just slightly. Another agent tapped her tablet and turned it toward Alina. On screen was the same video circulating online. She let it play. Alina didn't flinch when she heard the judge's voice. "You people think being quiet makes you smart." She closed her eyes just briefly when it reached the part where he smirked. There it is, always so sensitive. Then her moment cut in, her calm voice breaking through the tension. "I'm not here for your performance." The agent paused the video. "What most people didn't see," she said gently, "was the look on his face after you said that." Alina didn't answer. She didn't need to. They'd seen it. Everyone had. The DOJ woman finally spoke. "What you did wasn't just brave, Dr. Pierce. It was measured. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't insult him. You just held the mirror up." "I didn't go there to expose anyone," Alina replied, her voice quiet. "I went to defend the truth. But when someone refuses to see it, you have no choice but to make them look harder." One of the attorneys nodded. "Your composure has made waves. There are organizations reaching out to request your speaking engagement. You're being called everything from a hero to a silent warrior." "I'm not interested in labels," Alina said, "only change." The room grew quiet. The DOJ official leaned in. "Then let's talk about the next steps." Outside the building, the media had begun camping out. Not for Alina, they didn't even know she was there yet, but because word had spread that a sitting judge might be under review for conduct involving a racial bias case. No one had the full story. Not yet, but pieces of it were slipping out, and Kessler was feeling it. He had requested a private meeting with the presiding circuit judge, a rare move for him. In it, he explained politely that the charges in the Pierce case were misdirected and that it might be best to dismiss them quietly. He even suggested Alina be compensated for the court's error, but it was too late for quiet, and the presiding judge told him, in no uncertain terms, that an internal inquiry had already begun. Back in her apartment that evening, Alina stared out at the city skyline. She hadn't told anyone yet, not her mother, not her best friend, not her team at the firm, that she had been asked to speak before a congressional subcommittee on equal access to justice. But the invitation sat in her inbox. She knew what came next would be even harder than what she'd already faced. The attention, the scrutiny, the weight of speaking not just for herself, but for every young woman who had ever been dismissed, belittled, or doubted simply for existing in a room someone else thought they didn't belong. She didn't ask for this, but she wasn't walking away from it either. That night, she opened her laptop and began typing, not a speech, not a statement, but a letter, not to the court, to Judge Ronald Kessler. That it wasn't bitter, it wasn't angry, it was clear, firm, and filled with the kind of grace that comes from strength, not surrender. The first line read, "This is not a message of revenge, but of reflection." She didn't know if he'd read it, but she wrote it anyway, because Alina Pierce wasn't done, and the story was only beginning. Asterisk. The story could have ended there. Alina had done what many could never summon the strength to do: stand tall in the face of injustice without raising her voice, and somehow make the walls of a courtroom shake just by holding her ground. But life, especially when truth begins to surface, has a way of opening doors no one knew were there. 3 weeks after that hearing, Alina sat quietly on the 7th floor of a building that overlooked the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. She wasn't wearing courtroom gray or an office suit. Instead, she wore navy, strong, bold, yet calm, like someone who had walked through fire and hadn't burned, but had taken a piece of the flame with her. The room wasn't full of news cameras. It wasn't a press conference. It was something far more dangerous to people who feared the truth. It was a closed-door meeting with members of a Judicial Accountability Task Force, a real one, not just ceremonial. These were the people who reviewed misconduct complaints, quietly, but with real reach. And today, they weren't just here to listen to Alina. They were here because of her. A man from the oversight board cleared his throat. "Dr. Pierce, Before we proceed, I need to be candid with you. What you experienced in that courtroom was not isolated. Elena didn't move. She had sensed this already. Deep down she had known that the woman beside him opened a file. It wasn't one file, it was five. 5 cases, 5 defendants. All women, all black, all from the same courthouse, all under Judge Kessler. The board member continued. We've been reviewing transcripts, and more recently, recordings. Some were taken without the court's knowledge. We found patterns, words repeated, comments made not on the record but whispered just loud enough to be heard. Elena leaned forward. You're telling me this wasn't about me? No, the woman said. It started long before you, but you were the first one who didn't fold or explode. You did something different. You made silence feel loud. That sentence echoed in the room. She made silence feel loud. They began going through the cases. One by one, a nurse accused of theft charges dropped quietly after her lawyer threatened to go public with remarks the judge had made under his breath. A teacher whose credentials were questioned, not because of missing documents, but because someone like her couldn't possibly hold a master's degree. A young mother who requested an interpreter for her elderly grandmother, only to be told, we're not running a daycare for your people. And now Elena. What made hers different? She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She just stood still, still enough that everyone else could finally see. The storm wasn't hurt, was the bench. One of the members leaned forward. Dr. Pierce, we're considering recommending a full investigation, not just into Judge Kessler, but into how these cases were allowed to continue without red flags being raised. And we'd like your help. I'm not a lawyer, she said softly. No, but you're the one they listened to. Elena looked down for a moment. She thought about all the times she had been underestimated, in boardrooms, in interviews, in negotiations, the assumptions, the subtle tones, and now, here she was, sitting not as a defendant, not even as a victim, but as a catalyst. I'll do whatever I can, she said. That night, while Elena returned to her hotel room, hundreds of miles away in his study, Judge Kessler stared at an email forwarded from an anonymous internal account. It was a notice. The Judicial Review Board was launching an official inquiry into his conduct. A hearing would be scheduled. Witnesses would be called. Video would be reviewed. And yes, Dr. Elena Pierce had been invited to provide a sworn statement. He stood from his desk slowly, the color draining from his face. He didn't understand how it had come to this. He remembered the moment she walked into his courtroom. Quiet, controlled. He thought she was weak. He had tried to shake her, tried to break her with words he assumed she'd carry home like wounds. He didn't know she would carry them as evidence. He didn't know she would become the voice he couldn't silence. And then came the part he hadn't expected at all. As he scrolled down the message, there it was, an attachment. It was the letter Elena had written. He opened it. Only a few paragraphs, measured, gracious, unflinching. She didn't insult him. She didn't accuse him. She simply described what it felt like to stand in a room where someone was more focused on judging her identity than her integrity. And then she wrote something that shook him deeper than he expected. Some people walk into a courtroom hoping for mercy. I walked in expecting dignity, and when I didn't find it, I chose to carry my own. He closed the laptop. But the words stayed. Meanwhile, back in D.C., Elena received a late-night message from one of the oversight attorneys. It was a filer, private deposition taken years earlier from a former clerk in that courthouse. The message was short. You need to see this. You were never alone. They just never had anyone strong enough to stay standing. Elena clicked play, and the next chapter of the story began not in the courtroom, not on social media, but in a small, soundproof room where forgotten voices began to rise again. The sound of the recording still echoed in Elena's mind long after the screen went dark. She hadn't expected it to hit so hard. A young voice, barely 23, spoke through the statica. Former judicial clerk. The deposition was nearly 6 years old. She had been dismissed from her role, without public explanation. Now, for the first time, Elena heard why. I saw him shred files. Not once, not twice. Whole case records, the woman said. He'd say things like, no one's gonna miss this one, or she'll be fine doing community service. That's all they want anyway. I documented everything. I even wrote a memo. But the minute I brought it up, they reassigned me to the copy room. Then they let me go. The room had been quiet after she finished. The lawyers at the table didn't interrupt. No one needed to. The weight of her words did what the law hadn't. Alina sat in her hotel room, watching the city lights flicker through the tall windows. For the first time since the courtroom, she felt something new settle in her chest. Not fear, not anger, responsibility. She reached for her journal, the same one she had brought into the courtroom weeks earlier, a gift from her mother, the same one she had written in every night since her father passed. She flipped to a blank page and began writing, not just about what happened but what needed to happen next. 3 days later, she returned to the courthouse not as a defendant, but as a witness, not just for her case, but for a history that had gone unseen, unspoken, unrecorded. Until now, inside the grand hall where public hearings were held, the audience was smaller than she expected, but it was the people sitting there that mattered. Members of the Judicial Review Board, attorneys from the Civil Rights Division, clerks, reporters, and, in the far back row, a young woman with tightly braided hair and a grey sweater that looked all too familiar. Alina recognized her instantly, the same former clerk from the deposition. They exchanged a look, a quiet nod. No words needed. Then came the sound of the door creaking open. Judge Kessler entered, but this time, he wasn't wearing robes. He walked with a cane, now temporary, perhaps, but the symbolism was unavoidable. For a man who had once commanded silence with a glance, he now looked far smaller, almost ordinary. He took a seat near the front. The room did not rise for him. Alina stepped forward, swearing the oath with clear, unwavering words. She began her testimony with a from the courtroom, but from her childhood. She recalled a day when her father took her to a city museum. They stood in front of a broken water fountain encased in glass. 2 spouts, one marked white, the other marked colored. He told me, she said to the room, that one day we wouldn't need signs to know what was broken. We'd feel it. She paused, and in that courtroom, I felt it. The panel listened, eyes fixed, no interruptions. Alina recounted everything, not just the judge's words, but the tone, the atmosphere, the silent agreement in the room that no one dared disturb. I knew I wasn't the first, she said, but I was determined not to be the last who stayed quiet. She continued, describing the pattern, the disputiveness, the erasure of evidence, and then, with careful precision, she submitted her own record, documentation she had kept, emails, exchanged with court officers, timelines, and a list of names. It wasn't a speech, it was a statement, not just of fact, but of purpose. And when she finished, the room didn't erupt. It didn't need to. The silence was enough to know the impact had landed. After the hearing, outside the courthouse steps, the press gathered. Reporters called out questions. Microphones pushed forward. But Alina didn't stop. She walked down the steps quietly, just as she had entered them weeks before. This time, though, she wasn't alone. The young woman from the back row joined her. They exchanged a few words, then stopped on the corner, watching as traffic rolled past. You know, Kara said gently, I thought I was going crazy. I really thought maybe I had imagined it all. You didn't, Alina replied. No, but it took you standing there for me to believe that. A pause, then Alina asked, what are you doing now? Kara smiled faintly, thinking about going back to law school. Alina turned, surprised. You left. After they let me go, I couldn't stomach it. Felt like the system wasn't made for people like me. And now, Kara's answer came with quiet certainty. Now, I think maybe it is. If people like you keep showing up. They exchanged numbers. No fanfare. Just the start of something bigger. Later that night, Alina sat in her apartment, reflecting. She received a text from Ramirez, the court clerk, who had stayed silent that day in court, but had later helped surface the truth. It simply read, you gave us all permission to stop being afraid. Thank you. She didn't reply right away. Instead, she turned to her journal, flipping to that same page from days before. At the bottom, she added a final note. Justice doesn't start with the system. It starts when someone refuses to disappear. Alina had barely set her journal down when her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. We've never met, but I once knew the man you stood up to in court. I have something you need to see. Can we meet? No name, just an address, and a time 8:15 a.m. tomorrow. A small cafe tucked between a bookstore and a pharmacy, on the east end of the city. Alina stared at the screen. She should have been wary. She had every reason to ignore it. but something about the timing, something about the tone. It didn't feel like a threat. It felt like an opening. The next morning, the sky was still soft with pale dawn light as Alina stepped into the cafe. The scent of cinnamon and roasted espresso clung to the air. Only a few tables were occupied. A man, late 50s maybe, sat alone in the far booth, his hands folded neatly over a small leather-bound file. He looked up as she entered, his hair silver at the edges, but still sharp in expression. He motioned gently for her to sit. "You must be Alina." She nodded. "And you are Charles Merritt," he said, voice low but clear. "Calvin Kessler's former law clerk, and his brother-in-law." The name caught her off guard. She studied his face, but there was no arrogance, no superiority, only weight. The kind that doesn't come from power, but from regret. "I watched your hearing," he said. "What you did in that room, it wasn't just brave, it was necessary, and overdue." Alina tilted her head slightly. "So why reach out now?" Charles tapped the file in front of him. "Because I was part of what allowed it all to continue. Not directly, but through silence, through compromise. I thought I could change things from the inside. I couldn't. But you." He opened the folder, revealing documents older than Elena's own case. Names, signatures, sealed records that had been dismissed before ever reaching trial. These were victims of bias, just like you. Their cases went nowhere, lost in the shuffle. And I helped bury them. Alina leaned in. The names spanned decades, different cities, different counties, all with one commonality. Calvin Kessler had presided over them. "Why now?" she asked. Again, Charles didn't flinch. "Because someone like you showed me it's not too late to do the right thing. And because one of these names, someone from years ago, is still fighting, alone." He pulled out a faded photograph, a young woman, early 20s, holding a certificate, smiling wide. "She was my student. Her name is Nadine Ellis." Kessler had her locked into a technicality so complex it erased her chance at appeal. "She's still trying to clear her record after 20 years, and no one's listening." Alina reached for the photo gently, as if holding it too tightly might somehow crush everything it stood for. "Where is she now?" "She works nights at a hospital. Cafeteria, lives outside the city. Still sends letters to the Bar Association every year, hoping someone will reopen her case." Alina didn't hesitate. "I want to meet her." Charles nodded. "She deserves more than silence. And you're the first person I've believed might actually be able to help." That night, Alina drove out past the city limits, the highway, lit only by passing headlights and the glow of her dashboard. As the road narrowed and trees gathered like sentinels on either side, she felt something stern, not pressure, but purpose. When she arrived at the address, a modest one-story home with chipped paint and a tiny porch garden, the door opened before she could knock. Nadine Ellis stepped out, older now, but unmistakably the woman in the photo. Her eyes met Alina's, not with suspicion, but with quiet recognition. "You're the one from the trial," she said softly. Alina smiled. "And you're the one I'm here for." Inside, the air smelled like lavender and old books. They sat at the kitchen table, no formal introductions needed. Just stories. Nadine spoke slowly, carefully, like someone who had been unheard for too long. She shared her case, the accusation, the hearing, the feeling of walking into a courtroom already convicted by expression alone. "I didn't have money, or lawyers, just my word. And in that room, that wasn't enough." Alina listened. She didn't interrupt. She just took notes, pages of them, not for court, for clarity. Because Nadine's story wasn't an exception. It was the blueprint. "I remember," Nadine whispered near the end, "sitting in that chair while the judge stared at me, like I was wasting his time. I remember thinking, this is the moment I disappear. But I never did. I just got quiet." Alina reached across the table, her hand resting lightly over Nadine's. "You were never gone. You were waiting. Now it's time someone listened." The next morning, Alina returned to the city and filed a request publicly to have Nadine's case reviewed. She attached a declaration from Charles Merritt. She included copies of every sealed document he had given her, and this time, she made it public. Not for spectacle, but for justice. The media took hold quickly, but Alina didn't speak to cameras. She spoke to students, to legal boards, to community groups. She used her platform not for herself, but for the stories like Nadine's that had no microphone. Then, one day, she received a letter, handwritten, from someone unexpected. Judge Calvin Kessler. The letter was short, I watched everything unfold. You did what no one else ever dared, not just in court, but beyond it. You gave them a voice. I lost sight of what the law was supposed to protect. And for what it's worth, I hope one day, people remember you not because of what I did to you, but because of what you did for them. It was unsigned. Alina folded the paper, placed it in her journal, and wrote beneath it, "Redemption isn't given. It's chosen. By truth, by courage, and by those who refuse to look away." The weight of the letter sat heavily in Elena's hands as she stared out the rain-spattered window of her apartment. The ink still fresh, the words like echoes, bouncing inside her mind. Calvin Kessler's admission was more than just was a crack in the wall of silence, a door left slightly ajar in a system built on closing them. But the question pulsed louder than ever. Could one letter change decades of injustice? Could one woman's courage ripple far enough to reshape a broken system? The answer came faster than she expected. The morning after the letter, her phone buzzed with calls from reporters, activists, lawyers, and everyday people. The story had ignited a firestorm, millions watching as Nadine Ellis's case was officially reopened, as other victims found courage to come forward. Their voices no longer whispers but roars. Alina felt the surge of power and responsibility in equal measure. The fight was no longer hers alone. It belonged to everyone who had ever felt silenced, invisible, or powerless in the face of injustice. Courtrooms, once cold and forbidding, started to feel different, charged with new energy. Alina was invited to speak at legal forums, universities, and community centers, not as a victim, but as a beacon of hope and transformation. Each story she shared added weight to a growing movement demanding accountability, transparency, and empathy in justice. And then, the day came when she found herself back in that very courtroom where everything had begun. The room that had once held judgment and prejudice now brimmed with quiet anticipation. Cameras were banned. This was not a spectacle, but a reckoning dot. Calvin Kessler, older, thinner, his posture more subdued, took the stand. The man who once sneered at her now faced a sea of eyes demanding truth. Alina watched quietly from the side, her heart steady but fierce. He spoke, not with the arrogance of before, but with the humility of someone unmasked. He recounted the choices he'd made, the moments he'd failed, those who deserved justice. His voice faltered at times, but the weight of years pressed each word with gravity. As he finished, Alina rose, not to condemn, but to offer a path forward. "This system is not defined by the mistakes of its past," she said, voice ringing clear and calm. "It is defined by the courage of those willing to stand, speak, and change it." Her words were met with a silence so profound it seemed to pulse in the air. Then, applause, not just polite, but real, heartfelt, a sound of collective awakening. Outside the courthouse, the sun broke through the clouds, casting golden light across the city. Alina felt something she hadn't in years: hope. Because justice, she realized, isn't just a verdict or a sentence. It's a journey, a relentless, imperfect march toward truth. And every voice raised in that march, no matter how quiet, has the power to change the world. She walked away from the courthouse that day, not as a survivor, but as a trailblazer. The woman who had turned silence into strength, invisibility into visibility, and pain into purpose. And for every person who'd ever been told they weren't enough, Elena's story whispered this truth: your voice matters, your story matters, and no matter how dark the courtroom may seem, your courage can light the way. If this story moved you, remember, true justice begins when we refuse to be silent.